The entire auction house went quiet the moment the old upright piano was wheeled out from the back storage room. Not the respectful quiet of anticipation, the uncomfortable kind. The kind where people look away. It was missing 3 keys. The lacquer had peeled back along the left side in long strips, exposing raw wood the color of old bone. One of the brass pedals was bent sideways at an angle that suggested violence rather than age. The head appraiser from Harrington Fine Arts, a man named Jeffrey Platt, who had spent 30 years cataloging instruments across Ontario and Quebec, looked at the thing for perhaps 4 seconds before writing something in his notebook, and clicking his pen shut with a finality that seemed to end the conversation before it started. "It's beyond salvageable," he said to the room, not unkindly but not gently either. "The soundboard is cracked through, the action is seized. Whatever this once was, it isn't anymore." The woman standing beside him, Miriam Ashford, 61 years old, the founder of Ashford Heritage Music, one of the most respected instrument restoration companies in the country, pressed her lips together and said nothing. She had transported this piano from a climate-controlled warehouse in Halifax. She had paid for the crating herself. The instrument had belonged to her father, a Czechoslovakian immigrant named Joseph Ashford, who had carried the name on his papers but the music in his hands, and who had played this exact piano every Sunday morning in a rented house in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, until the morning he didn't wake up. The piano was the last thing that existed in the world that connected Miriam to the sound of her father's hands. Jeffrey Platt was not wrong, technically. The piano was in catastrophic condition. What he did not know was that standing in the far corner of the auction house loading bay, half hidden behind a shipping pallet, was a man holding a thermos of cold coffee and wearing a jacket with a torn left pocket, and that this man had been quietly listening to everything. His name was Stephen Darrow, and he thought he might be able to fix it. Nobody in that room understood what was about to happen. If you believe that some people carry gifts the world has simply forgotten to recognize, stay with this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Stephen Darrow was 43 years old, and lived in a rented half of a duplex on the east side of Hamilton, Ontario, 3 blocks from a steel plant that groaned through the night, like something trying to remember what it used to be. He worked out of a converted garage attached to the duplex. His landlord had stopped charging him for it, after Stephen spent 2 weekends replacing the man's rotting floor joists without being asked, and the garage was so full of piano parts, string coils, damper felts, and hardwood bracing that there was barely room to stand sideways between the workbenches. His daughter Rosie was 9 years old. She did her homework at the end of the left workbench, most evenings, the one clear space in the shop, sitting on a stool Stephen had built for her out of maple scraps, her notebook balanced between a bag of tuning pins and a thermos exactly like the one her father always had in his hand. They had been on their own for 3 years. Stephen's wife, Anna, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer in the spring of Rosie's 5th year, and she died the following February, during a stretch of Hamilton winter so relentless that the funeral home had to wait an extra day to open the ground. Stephen had taken a leave from his position as a junior lecturer in music technology at Master University. The leave became a resignation, became a silence, became the sound of tools in a cold garage at midnight while a small girl slept in the next room. He had been, before grief rearranged everything, considered one of the more gifted acoustic instrument restoration specialists of his generation in Canada. He had published 2 papers on historical piano action systems. He had a waiting list. He had ambitions that involved a workshop of his own in a proper building with proper light. After Anna died, the waiting list evaporated because Stephen couldn't answer emails. The papers sat half-finished on a hard drive he rarely opened. The investors who had expressed interest in backing a restoration studio quietly found other places to put their money when it became clear that Stephen Darrow was not currently a man who could be relied upon to return phone calls. He did not blame them. He was not reliable. He was surviving. What he did not lose, could not lose even when he wanted to, was the ability to hear a piano, the way other people might walk into a room and notice the smell or the light. Stephen walked in and heard what sound the space would hold, what an instrument in that room was doing or failing to do, what a specific piano was trying to tell him about itself, if he would only sit still and listen. That was what took him to the Harrington auction house on a Tuesday morning in late October. He hadn't been invited. He went to auctions the way some people go to estate sales, not to buy, but to look, to see what had come loose from the world and was floating free. Rosie was at school. He had a thermos of coffee, and nowhere important to be until 3 o'clock. He heard the appraiser's verdict from across the room. He walked over slowly. He stood beside the piano for a long moment without touching it, which is what he always did first, the way you might stand beside a person before you speak to them. Then he crouched down and looked at the underside of the keyboard frame. He stood back up. He looked at Miriam Ashford, who was staring at the floor. The soundboard crack runs parallel to the grain, Stephen said quietly. That's stabilizable, the action being seized. That's humidity damage, not structural failure. The keys can be recast. The missing ones too, if you can tell me what year the instrument was manufactured. Miriam looked at him for the first time. She was a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of face that suggested she had not slept consistently well in some months. 1953, she said. Czech manufacture. My father brought it over in 1971. Stephen nodded slowly. Then the action parts are reproducible. There's a workshop in Kitchener that still mills the original tolerance specs for European uprights from that period. Geoffrey Platt had been watching Nias exchange with the patient expression of a man who has heard confident amateurs before. The soundboard, Platt said. You can't restore a cracked soundboard, you replace it, and to replace it in an instrument of this age, with this construction, you'd have to essentially rebuild the piano from the inside out. The cost would be. I know what the cost would be, Stephen said. He wasn't being rude, he was being precise. He looked at Miriam again. I've rebuilt 2 Czech uprights from this era. One of them is in a teaching conservatory in Guelph right now, and it sounds better than the day it left the factory. He paused. I know that probably doesn't mean much coming from someone you've never heard of. It means something, Miriam said. She was studying him carefully, not with hope, exactly, with something more cautious than hope. Why would you want to take this on? Stephen thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I know what it is, he said. And because I think I know what it was. Miriam Ashford was not a sentimental woman by nature. She had built her company through 30 years of unsentimental decisions. She had walked away from partnerships that didn't serve her, closed divisions that weren't performing, made calls that people thought were cold, and that turned out to be correct. Against the advice of Geoffrey Platt and her own operations manager, she let Stephen Darrow load the piano into his truck. The restoration took 4 months. Stephen worked on it the way he worked on everything, slowly, at odd hours, with the radio on low. He had a collection of CBC radio recordings that Rosie had made fun of since she was old enough to have opinions about music. He played them on a small Bluetooth speaker, balanced on the window ledge above the workbench. The signals came and went. He didn't mind. The soundboard was the first problem and the hardest. The crack had to be cleaned, dried, and bridged with a process that involved wooden cleats cut to specific grain angles, and a kind of patience that cannot be rushed, without ruining everything. Stephen spent the better part of 3 weeks on the soundboard alone, working after Rosie went to bed, emerging from the garage at 1 or 2 in the morning, to find the house exactly as he'd left it. Small, quiet, full of the particular stillness that comes from being a home, where one of the people who made it a home is no longer there. He did not talk about Anna often. But he thought about her while he worked. She had been a music teacher. Elementary school, 30 kids in a portable classroom with a battered upright piano that Stephen had tuned for her every September as a kind of unofficial gift. That was also an excuse to see her. She would have found the whole situation, the Czech piano, the Halifax billionaire, the cracked soundboard, enormously interesting. She would have had opinions. She would have sat on the stool by the workbench, and talked while he worked, and he would have felt, as he always had while she talked, like the luckiest man in a specific radius. Rosie came into the garage some evenings and sat with him, while he explained what he was doing. She was a precise, attentive child, who inherited her father's ability to be still, and her mother's habit of asking the exact question that cut to the center of a thing. If you fix it perfectly, she said one evening, watching Stephen carefully fit a new damper felt into its slot, will it sound exactly like it did when her dad played it? Stephen thought about that for a moment. No, he said, it'll sound like itself again, which is different. When something gets restored properly, it doesn't go backward, it goes forward into what it always had the potential to be. Rosie considered this. Does that mean it'll be better? Sometimes, he said. Yes, she went back to her homework. He went back to the felt. Miriam Ashford visited the garage on a Saturday in December, 6 weeks into the restoration. She drove herself, a 4-hour drive from Toronto in a rental car, which struck Stephen as significant. He'd assumed she'd send someone. She arrived at 8 in the morning without announcing she was coming. He was already in the garage. So was Rosie in her pajamas, eating toast on the maple stool. Miriam stood in the doorway of the garage and looked at the piano, which by then had been partially disassembled. The action pulled entirely, the keys removed, the interior casing propped open so the soundboard repairs could breathe properly. It looked in that state, more ruined than it had at the auction house. "This is Rosie," Stephen said. "Hello," said Rosie. She held out the plate of toast in a gesture of offering that was either very generous or very practical. Miriam blinked, then she smiled, which rearranged her face considerably. "No, thank you," she said. "It's kind of you." She walked slowly around the piano, looking at the work. Stephen watched her look at it. He had learned, over years of restoration work, that you could tell a great deal about how someone felt about an instrument, by the way their hands moved when they were near it. Whether they touched it or didn't, where they reached for first. Miriam's hands stayed at her but they weren't still. "He played every Sunday," she said, not to Stephen exactly, but not away from him either. "Every Sunday morning from before I could remember until he couldn't anymore, the same pieces mostly. Things he'd learned as a boy in Brno. He said the piano remembered the music even when he forgot the notes." She paused. "I used to think that was a sweet thing to say, now I think he was right." Stephen said nothing. This was another thing he'd learned. There are moments when the most useful thing is to not fill the space. "My people told me this was a mistake," Miriam said, not cruelly. "They were probably right, from a business standpoint. The cost will far exceed any value the instrument could ever be appraised at." She turned to look at him. "What made you think you could do it when no one else would try?" Stephen wiped his hands on a shop rag. He thought about deflecting. He thought about giving the professional answer, the one about the soundboard grain, and the humidity damage, and the Kitchener workshop. Instead he said, "Because I know what it's like to have something that mattered become something people tell you isn't worth keeping anymore." Miriam held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way people nod when they decide to believe something they weren't entirely sure they could. She stayed for 2 hours. She drank a cup of instant coffee from Stephen's kitchen, without complaint. She answered Rosie's questions about Halifax, which were numerous and specific. She left without ceremony, driving back down the street in the rental car, while Stephen stood on the driveway in the cold. After that, she came back every 3 weeks. The word spread the way it always does in specialist communities, sideways, through unlikely channels, in the form of skepticism, that gradually sounded less convinced of itself. An instrument restoration forum that Stephen had occasionally contributed to years earlier, before he stopped contributing to things, picked up a mention that someone in Hamilton was attempting a full structural rebuild on a 50-year-old Czech upright with a cracked soundboard. The consensus was that it couldn't be done, or rather, that it could be done, but would produce a piano that sounded like a restored piano rather than an original one, which, in the estimation of certain people who spent considerable time on forums, was a meaningful distinction. A writer from a Toronto music journal contacted Miriam Ashford's office asking if there was a story. Miriam's communications team declined politely. The writer found Stephen's old McMaster profile anyway, noted his credentials, noted the gap in his publications record, and wrote a piece that was not unkind, but was not optimistic either. The piece suggested, in the careful language of someone who wanted to be fair, but also accurate, that ambition in the absence of institutional support often produces heartfelt failures rather than genuine restoration. Stephen read the piece at the workbench at midnight. Then he put his phone down and kept working. There was a night in February, the same month Anna had died, 3 years earlier, when Stephen came very close to calling Miriam and telling her it wasn't going to work. Not because the technical problems had defeated him. Because he sat down inside the partially assembled piano casing at 2 in the morning, the way you might sit inside a tent or a small shelter, and thought, I don't know if I can keep being the person who believes in things when I am this tired. Rosie found him there when she came to the garage, to tell him she couldn't sleep. She was wearing her winter socks, and her hair was tangled from the pillow. She looked at her father sitting inside the piano, and did not seem alarmed by this, which said something about the life they'd built together. Are you okay? She asked. I will be, he said. She sat on the floor beside him, leaning against the piano's outside casing. After a while she said, Mom would think this was cool. Stephen breathed slowly. Yeah, he said. She would. They sat there for 20 minutes in the quiet of the garage with the radio off and the cold outside pressing against the windows. Then Rosie went back to bed, and Stephen stood up and picked up his tools. The piano was ready in late March. Stephen tuned it on a Wednesday afternoon while Rosie was at school, and when he played the first chord, just a simple open C, nothing dramatic, the sound that came out of the instrument stopped him completely. It was not that sound of a restored piano. It was the sound of a piano that had decided to begin. He sat on the bench for a long time without playing anything else. The garage was very quiet. Outside, someone 2 streets over was using a leaf blower. A Canada goose made its seasonal complaints somewhere above the roofline. He called Miriam and told her it was done. There was a silence on her end that lasted long enough for him to wonder if the call had dropped. I'll be there Friday, she said. She arrived Friday afternoon with her operations manager, a compact, efficient man named Douglas, who carried a clipboard and looked like he had opinions about logistics. They stood in the garage while Stephen played a scale, then a simple etude. Then, without quite deciding to, the first few bars of something romantic, early Schumann. Douglas looked at his clipboard as if he were checking something, but his pen was still. Miriam sat down on the maple stool that was Rosie's, and did not say anything for a very long time. Play it again, she said finally. Stephen played it again. When he stopped, Miriam Ashford, the woman who had built a company across 3 decades, who had been described in the Globe and Mail as one of the most formidable figures in Canadian heritage arts, who had not cried publicly since her father's funeral, pressed one hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling. Douglas very carefully found something to read on his clipboard. Rosie, who had arrived home from school 20 minutes earlier, and was sitting on the back step, eating an apple with her boots still on, watched all of this through the garage doorway with quiet attention. After a while, Miriam said, He's in there. She meant her father. She meant Joseph, who had played on Sunday mornings in Dartmouth, who had carried music across an ocean in his hands. Yes, Stephen said, he is. What happened next surprised the industry more than the restoration itself. Miriam Ashford, at the spring conference of the Canadian Heritage Arts Council, held at a hotel in Ottawa, stood at a podium in front of 400 practitioners, collectors and institutional representatives, and told the story of the piano. She did not make it a triumphant story, exactly, she made it a true one. She talked about what it meant to lose a physical connection to someone you loved. She talked about the economics of restoration work. How the field was losing skilled practitioners because the economics didn't work. Because the knowledge was not being passed on. Because institutions were not investing in the people who held it. She talked about a man in a garage in Hamilton, whose papers she had read after the fact, whose reputation she had not previously known, who fixed a thing that 3 senior appraisers had declared unfixable. Then she announced the establishment of the Ashford Darrow Fellowship in Instrument Restoration. A funded, 3-year program that would support emerging specialists across Canada in acquiring the skills and equipment to do exactly the kind of work that was disappearing from the country. The room applauded. Stephen was not at the conference. He was in the garage in Hamilton, building a new case for a 1930s, Canadian-made cottage organ that a woman in Muskoka had mailed him about after reading the Toronto Journal piece. Rosie was at the workbench doing long division. When Miriam called to tell him about the fellowship, he sat down on an overturned crate and looked at his hands. You didn't ask me, he said. No, she agreed. I didn't. I apologize for that. A pause. Would you have said yes if I had? He thought about it honestly. I don't know. That's why I didn't ask, she said, with something that might have been warmth. The fellowship is already named. I'm afraid you're committed to the legacy portion of your own story. He looked at the Muskoka organ parts spread across the second workbench. He looked at Rosie, who was chewing her pencil, and frowning at a long division problem with the total absorption of someone who takes numbers seriously. You named it Ashford Darrow, he said. I named it after the people who made it possible, she said. Joseph built the piano, you built it back. That seems like the right order. Stephen was quiet for a moment. The second name, he said, in the fellowship, you said Ashford Darrow. Yes, is the second name, is that me, or, it's both, Miriam said quietly. I thought you might want it to include Anna. He didn't answer for a while. Outside the garage window the March sky was the particular pale gray of early Canadian spring, the color of something deciding whether or not to change. Yes, he said finally. Thank you. The restored piano now lives in the main hall of the Ashford Heritage Music Institute's new wing in Toronto, on permanent display but also available for use. Miriam had insisted on that, the playing part, because her father would have considered a piano that couldn't be played to be a contradiction in terms. Rosie Darrow, who is now 12, has been learning to play on a spare upright in her father's garage. She has her grandmother's stubbornness about scales, and her father's ability to sit inside a piece of music until the music opens up for her. She does not remember her mother, the way adults remember people, in stories and facts, but she remembers the feeling of being held. She keeps that in the same place she keeps the music. Somewhere below language, somewhere that doesn't need explaining. Stephen Darrow still works out of the same garage. The fellowship has meant that 3 young restorers have come through Hamilton in the last year, working alongside him for weeks at a time, learning the things he knows in the way those things have always been learned. Slowly, by hand, in a cold space with a radio playing something in the background that nobody is quite listening to. He is not a wealthy man, he does not expect to become one, but the waiting list is back, and every Sunday morning, before Rosie wakes up, he goes into the garage and plays a few minutes of whatever is in his hands that week. Sometimes something he knows, sometimes something new, sometimes just a single chord held long enough to fill the room. He does not know if Anna can hear it, he plays it anyway. Some things are worth doing in the absence of certainty. Some things you do, because the doing itself is the answer to a question you never quite figured out how to ask. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that the broken things aren't always finished. And find us on Resilience Tales for more stories about the quiet kinds of courage that don't make headlines but change everything anyway.